Asia, after the European Union, is considered as the most connected region in the world. The region, which is booming with economic growth and prosperity, can unfold some valuable lessons for Nepal, which, in terms of consumer behavior, adaptability, and outlook, resembles countries in Southeast Asia rather than South Asia. What learnings can Nepal derive from a region that has benefited from substantial connectivity? Ladies and gentlemen, to discuss on these topics and to carry forward the session, I'd like to invite our moderator for this key session, Mr. Sujeev Shakya on stage, founder and CEO, Bead Management. I'd also like to invite our speakers on stage, Ms. Gwen Robinson, Editor-at-Large, Nikkei Asia Review, Ms. Neeta Pokhrel, Unit Head, Project Administration, South Asia Urban and Water Division, ADB Manila, and Mr. Valentino S. Bagatsing, President and CEO at Investment and Capital Corporation of the Philippines, ICCP. So ladies and gentlemen, with this stage all set, with our moderator and panelists all ready to see what lessons from the East can we learn, may I please now request our moderator, Mr. Sujeev Shakya, founder and CEO, Bead Management, to continue with the session.
Thank you, Sadiksha. A warm welcome. We had an amazing opening session. I think a lot of things were discussed, and we will try to take the discussions ahead from there and look at lessons from the East. And when we were trying to curate this session, we thought that how do we look at lessons from the East? And we said, who should be in the panel? And now we have today, on my extreme right, Gwen Robinson with Nikkei Asia Review, has worked in this region for long enough. And Neeta from Nepal, in Australia, and now in Manila. She brings her own perspectives. And of course, there's Val, who did spend 4 years in Nepal and back again to share his own perspectives. So without much ado, the way the session is going to work is that we have 60 minutes for this session. And that will include about 15 minutes of Q&A and interactions from the floor. As Sadiksha was mentioning, please do download the app. We are going to take questions only from the app. And there's a way you can just ask a question so that we can have more questions coming from the floor. With that, I would like to start from Gwen, and maybe you could share, where does, you connect from lessons from the East, and coming from the East, what you do, and what are your opening remarks?
Thanks very much, Sujeev, and hello, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here and hear the outstanding previous talks, which actually said a lot of things that I think we all want to say. So forgive us if there's a bit of repetition. I just will very briefly tell you about my involvement in the region. I've been reporting, writing and researching Asia with a focus on Southeast and North Asia for some decades, actually. And about 6 years ago, joined the Nikkei, which is Japan's premier financial economic news organization. There was a feeling in Nikkei that despite efforts to have an English language publication, and that has been going for some decades, there was a feeling that the region really needed some high-quality journal digest of regional affairs largely by Asians for Asians. So after 20 years with the Financial Times as a correspondent and editor, I joined Nikkei to launch the Nikkei Asian Review, which is a website and weekly magazine just dedicated to Asia. And we mean Asia in the broadest sense of the word. So that was launched about 5-6 years ago. And about 18 months later, Nikkei decided to buy the Financial Times. So now the Japanese own the Financial Times, which is where I worked for many years. And I think it has become a perfect convergence of both Western expertise and Asian reporting and editing talents. And that's where and how I've been covering and watching the region for the last 5 years. So I'll give you some thoughts later on that.
Thank you, Gwen. So, Neeta, your opening remarks, and where do you come from?
Thank you, Sujeev. As Gwen says, it's an honor to be here. For me, it's also a great privilege because I come home. I work with Asian Development Bank. I manage the portfolio of Urban and Water Division in SARD, South Asia Regional Department of ADB. As Sujeev mentioned, I live in the Philippines, have been doing so for 7 years. I travel a lot. South Asia is what we cover. But in Southeast Asia, as I am based there, and also we interact a lot with our colleagues who work there. And as a tourist, I travel around Southeast Asia because it's just in the heart of it. For me, and I'm an engineer, we hear a lot of very right remarks. Our predecessors, previous speakers talked about connectivity is not just infrastructure. And I fully agree, but maybe I'm a little bit biased because I'm an engineer. But you still can't give water through Wi-Fi yet. You have to dig and put pipes. And you still have to build railways. And we watch, it is actually South Asia, the reason I work, is the fastest growing economy, faster than Southeast. But we are least connected. So it's interesting for us to watch where have we lapsed, where do we build, how fast we build. We have to leapfrog, but then again, is it possible to leapfrog without the right infrastructure and the mindsets and the policies? So I will be, as I speak, drawing parallels to not just Southeast, South Asia continuously. So allow me to keep anchoring back to South Asia, please.
No, thanks. That's really great. Sort of the, alternating between Southeast Asia and South Asia. Val, your opening remarks.
Sure. Namaskar, everybody. Namaste. It's nice to be back. I see a lot of familiar faces here today. I've had 5 jobs when I worked in the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, but not because I'm here, but the best years of my life were spent here in Kathmandu. So I had a lot of experiences, a lot of friends. I was also lucky enough to I signed the project development agreement for the Upper Trishuli, which is the largest FDI in Nepal for hydro with ADB. I'm happy to see it financially closed a couple of months ago. I was also, is Siddhant Pandey around? I was also the one who signed BO2, Business Oxygen, during my term. And also the first Marriott, with it, the Sheraton and the big Marriott followed after that, the one in Tamil. So it's nice to see the airport very bright. Before when I was coming in, it was so dark, I was tripping. But, so I've worked in Laos, I've worked in Nepal, and now I'm back in my country, the Philippines. I retired from the World Bank in May, so I started working again in September. But I think the session is very apt. Of course, I'm biased being Filipino. There's a lot of parallels between our two countries, which we can go into later. But more importantly, there's a lot of lessons, mistakes, successes, and what have yous that I think Nepal and all of us can learn from each other this afternoon.
Thanks. I'll just stick to you, Val. And we were discussing about the parallels between Nepal and Philippines. Maybe just, a few thoughts on that. We'll start with that. And then, where do you see the parallels between, we are going to look east and, the parallels with Philippines?
I don't want to go into some sort of academic exercise, okay? Maybe the best parallel I can show you is everybody, please raise your hand whoever passed by Doha, Qatar, on your way here or elsewhere or anywhere in the Middle East. So what happens when you get off the plane during a layover at Doha? More often than not, if you're a VIP, you get somebody will take you, and usually they're Filipino. Yeah. Okay, by the time you get to the lounge, the guy serving you coffee is Nepali.
Yeah.
If you get sick, you trip, you go to the hospital in the Middle East, more often than not, your nurse is Filipino. And then the orderly is Nepali. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
Sure, thanks. So this is, yeah, that's a commonality we are trying to weave and to see that how we connect to this session. And maybe I'll go with Gwen. And sitting in this region, sitting in Bangkok and traveling around Asia, where do you see the whole story of connectivity emerging? We'll talk about the challenges later, but what have you been seeing in the past, couple of years, in the past decade, in terms of how Southeast Asia internally is connecting?
Well, speaking as someone who lives and works in Bangkok for a decade, but traveling throughout Asia, but with a particular focus on the region, I can say 10 years ago when I moved to Bangkok, the word connectivity was just coming up in ASEAN circles, and it was a big theme in 2011. And just tracking through these last 10 years, you can see it has just exploded in sort of a frenzy of infrastructure building, funded through various ways. And I think it must be very tedious for people in a different region like we're sitting in now to be lectured or told by someone from Southeast Asia, oh, this is what Southeast Asians are doing, and maybe Nepal and this region should look at that. But what's been very impressive is, Southeast Asian countries are not really known as being so collegiate. Everyone has their own agendas. Cambodia, Philippines, Thailand, very independent-minded. But the binding glue has been ASEAN and a lot of regional cooperation mechanisms. And I think what we've seen in the last 5 years is the rise of some call it the rise of mini-lateralism, a kind of breakdown of big organisations into smaller groupings, and particularly a division, I think, in Asia, Southeast Asia, of mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. So we've seen mainland Southeast Asia form, like the Greater Mekong sub-region has formed its own identity, really, 5 countries of the Greater Mekong sub-region. This is now giving rise to sort of a lot of connectivity projects and cooperation on cross-border, planning for everything from customs and dealing with duties and agreements that actually drive these projects forward, to border towns, special economic zones, border crossing points, which when I first moved to the region, there was no way to cross into Myanmar from Thailand legally and drive a truck through. And now there are numerous border points. So I think that's been a very encouraging thing. I do have views on challenges, but we can come back to that.
We'll come back to the challenges. So, Neeta, I mean, you've been working in South Asia. You've been living and traveling in Southeast Asia. Where do you see this whole connectivity discourse, and what are the differences you see, and what are some of the commonalities you see around that?
Thank you, Sujeev. For me, the commonalities I see is drive towards decentralization. I say drive because nobody's got there yet. I think with us, we have a long way to go. And in South Asia, not just Nepal, India, I work mostly in India. India is ADB's largest client now. Nepal is pretty big also, but still India is the largest. They are struggling with decentralization. They started long back. And when you're trying to drive connectivity, you can't just have central powers doing the planning, central powers doing the pushing. It's not connectivity to just the economic corridors, it's internal connectivity, as our previous speakers talked about. And for that, you need local leadership, which we lack. Whereas I find that a lot higher in Southeast Asia. And not across other South Asian countries, but southern cities in India. I just came via Kolkata. I had to do loan reviews there. And of course, it's highly decentralized. So that local drive, decentralization, we are very much there to get. In terms of private, I see a lot of private sector colleagues here, which is great, entrepreneurs. Private sector funding into services and infrastructure. Private sector is doing great in Nepal, but nobody's putting a dime into infrastructure and running the services. Whereas we see a lot of that in Southeast Asia.
Okay.
So
infrastructure is what is being driven.
Sorry, I'm biased.
Sorry.
I'm an engineer, but
Yeah, okay.
still, even for the infrastructure, as I said, it's not just the infrastructure, but decentralization, the local voices, rural underdevelopment in Nepal. Again, it has to rise from within and rise locally. That I see very strongly in Southeast Asia.
No, thanks. I think, so coming to you, talking about infrastructure, and which also means that infrastructure brings you to investments. And Val, you've been, part of a multilateral agency for long, and now you're, a part of an investment, sort of a bank. So where do you see, in terms of the money part, how much that does play a big role in terms of pushing connectivity, and what have been any anecdotal stories you have around? That'll be wonderful.
Well, I mean, trade flows have already been established here and in the region for centuries. Okay, capital flows is something that will drive that infrastructure that Neeta was talking about. I mean, Nepal of 5 years ago is different from Nepal of today, obviously. I mean, there's so much progress already done as far as the contractual foundations that will create that infrastructure to begin with. So now the key is the implementation, as usual. The devil is in the details. So, there are several aspects of the economy that can be prodded, okay? Now that is, of course, the government, as the Right Honorable said, you cannot look at the government all the time to save you, but it's not the saving that's really important, but the enabling. So it's just to create the atmosphere and my favorite quote from this, the late Mancur Olson, the Nobel Prize winner, there's only two things you need for a society to thrive. Okay, equal protection under the law, and you minimize predation. What does that mean? It means that the strong cannot keep taking advantage of the weak. So you equalize that, and then you will have a prosperous society.
Okay, I think this is something that more of a personal interest to me, because I think in Nepal, if you look at from the time you left Nepal, if you look at GDP of Nepal, it has grown. We have more budget allocations for infrastructure. We have more investments coming in from multilaterals, coming from bilaterals, DFIs. But what is one thing, if you would say, what is it that Southeast Asia does differently than what we do in Nepal, and what could be that one thing we can learn from? We can just start with that.
I mean, the Southeast Asia is a very diverse 10 country. If you look at ASEAN itself, it's 10 countries. And you have a whole range, from a command economy like Vietnam to a freewheeling democracy like my country. So it's very, somewhere the magic secret sauce is in between.
Sure.
You cannot completely say, let's have a command economy, or you cannot say, let's have freewheeling democracy.
Sure.
So you have to adjust. So the important thing really that I can see is mistakes have to be encouraged quickly so that you can adjust.
Thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think
Gwen.
what Southeast Asia is doing really well, that I'm amazed. I think that you've pointed this out in your books, Sujeev, and writings constantly, but I think what Southeast Asia has done really well is leverage location. Its location, collectively and also individually. So as I said, the coming together in the Mekong, but also getting their act together with ASEAN. And I'm amazed at Nepal's incredibly strategic location, and as you've written and everybody knows, the kind of bridge between India and China thing. And you don't get so much of the sense here as you do in Southeast Asia of the squeeze between China and the US. It's more here, China and India, I guess. But still, it strikes me that there's two things lacking here. One is not enough of leveraging the location and using that to get better deals and deal with, big powers. But secondly, cooperation within this region. And, I asked you about that earlier, and it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of, super connectivity and cooperation going on between Nepal and neighbouring countries. So maybe that's two things that could be learnt from Southeast Asia. I'm not saying Southeast Asia is perfect. I mean, they're all out for their own,
Sure.
own improvements.
I think, Gwen, since you have, we're discussing this, I just want you to, among the countries, I totally agree with you, Val, we are talking about 10 countries in Southeast Asia, but when we keep chatting about Myanmar, Burma, and what have you been seeing, over these couple of years? Because I think when we look at, again, at a personal interest, looking at fragile countries that become frontier investment destination, be it in Africa, be it in, Latin America, or be it in East Asia. So where do you see some of the things that, as you're going to Myanmar, that you have found it very interesting that would be useful when we are talking about the connectivity discourse around in South Asia or in Nepal?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually I've been watching Myanmar particularly closely for the last 10 years. In fact, when I arrived at the region, Aung San Suu Kyi was still under house arrest and was just released at the end of 2010. And my first visit there in the modern era, I was there in the 80s, was just a broken, completely, practically a failed state, that had had decades of ruinous military management or mismanagement. And I think in some ways Myanmar comes in for a lot of criticism because of human rights issues and other things. And now Aung San Suu Kyi's gone from hero to zero, but actually, if you look, the country has done extraordinarily well over the last, particularly 8 years, and is growing, and contrary to belief, has not taken such a big hit from the last couple of years. And what it's done really well, I'm returning again to this, but I think leveraging the location and getting its act together on the investment front, people will say, of course, it had the advantage of China's immense interest, and then the US moving in to try and... So it's become a little bit of a prize of sorts and a litmus test for big power rivalry in the region. So it is attracting a lot of funding, but I think they've played it quite smart, and especially trying to entice in the mid-levels of private investors. And we're not talking about the big US ones.
Sure,
These
sure.
are smaller Asian investors, particularly Singaporeans and others.
No, yeah.
Sujeev,
Yeah.
I
Neeta.
want to add to that. Actually, in 2012, when the world started re-engaging and the development partners like ourselves and World Bank and others went in, I was part of a small team to do the urban strategy for Myanmar. And it just reminded me when Gwen talked about it. When we met the head of the urban ministry, he told our team, please don't tell me the successes that has happened in your urban sector interventions. I only want to know about the failures.
Wow.
So we ended up collating all the urban sector strategy failures and pitfalls and totally, this was for me, I've been working for 25 years in urban and water sector. A client saying, because everybody says best lessons learned, best, And so it was very refreshing for us. I know they're still struggling. Our Myanmar portfolio isn't doing great. But it was refreshing for a secretary of the ministry to say, I don't want to know successes. Tell me what didn't work.
Yeah, thanks, Neeta. So I'll just get back to you in terms of, we had Bruno and Raja Mohan talk a lot of the China part, and of course we heard from Andy also, but then, the China side is there, but you're working in India, and what are some of the things that are happening? Of course, that is South Asia, but what are some of the things that are happening at the grassroots or the, sort of the municipal level in India that also, is slightly different than what happens in Southeast Asia, and what is working? Because for us, whatever said and done, our learnings from South Asia is much more easier to manage because of the cultural aspects. So where do you are there some anecdotal stories you want to share?
Sure. I have been working in India since 2004, and I find it fascinating, again, because of the cultural similarities and closeness. The most striking for me is the capacity to be self-reliant, or the want to be self-reliant in designing, in planning, in implementing is much higher than here. I find even in Southeast Asia, they do central level. Many countries do central level planning, central level urban strategies. So I think India's got right. It's all, very few things are at federal. all state. Even within state, of course, the northern side hasn't got the decentralization drive. The south, the cities will tell you what they want. Development partners like us will be told, sometimes not in a very nice way. You want to play, you play there. This is what we need. That we see a lot more assertive in India than we do in Southeast Asia. So, and the capacity, again, I mean, I also worked directly in Nepal for 4 or 5 years. I was based here. I'm still working here. I've never left Nepal in my professional realm. And I always shake our colleagues here, all the ministries I work with, to say, what do you want? Don't let donors tell you what they want or what is right. And they still hesitate. You know, we have this innate, do we really know? And I also always say, look, we, in South Asia, Nepal included, we produce very high quality engineers. Give 5 years, they will stop reviewing any design or doing design. They are so consultant reliant. That is a lot less now in India, that ability to plan, again, much more decentralized, drive, implement, design. So that is for me very, more so than in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is still quite centrally given, strategic, central strategies, then it cascades down to local level, which they do drive, but the other way is stronger in India, I find.
Okay, I think moving to Val, I think we just started, if you would like to comment on any of the, sort of what Neeta and Gwen is saying, and then I'll have a question for you after that.
I mean, when you talk of connectivity, you cannot not ignore the gorilla in the room that we will talk about tomorrow, which is climate. Okay, and the fact that urban and cities, they're the front lines. Okay, and they are the people that suffer the most. So if you will relate that to connectivity, then the fact that, there's a big capacity gap that occurs. That's why Neeta mentioned the engineer anecdote. So I'm very quite passionate about the STEM. I mean, both our countries are having this demographic dividend. Okay?
Yeah.
My country, median age is 24.4. Yours is
22.7.
22.7. We should not let that go. Okay, that is a golden opportunity. And that will only happen once every, 50, 100 years. After that, it's gone.
So do you see that the demographic dividends is something that countries in Southeast Asia did leverage? I think Philippines is one, but are there others you've been also seeing?
Remember, it's yin yang. Okay, there's a lot of monasteries here. It's a double-edged sword.
Sure,
if you don't take care of it, then you can have an Arab Spring. You'll have a lot of young people who will just rebel. So the important thing is to motivate them, to educate them, to connect them.
Okay, so let's, I think before we go into another, I think it's not to only paint the rosy picture and say what are the opportunities, what's happening, but as we were discussing earlier, as to some of the problems, and I think, what Neeta was sharing about, Myanmar talking about what are the problems, tell you a problem. So what are some of the challenges you see with South Asia as it's grown, you've been seeing? So Gwen, maybe I'll start with you and I'll come to Neeta and Val later.
Yes, well, I'm glad you raised that because one of my pet issues is, and where I think this region could really learn a lot from Southeast Asia's example. And again, I'm going to tell a little anecdote that is actually, again, with a Myanmar, a Burmese official early on when I was trying to do a piece on the opening up of Myanmar and the tourism potential. One of the top tourism officials said to me, we do not want to become another Cambodia. And, that really watch them roll out policies that, for example, immediately banned jet skis from beaches, instituted laws that you couldn't build more than one story along some of the most scenic beaches, those sort of things. And frankly, when you sit in Southeast Asia and go around some of the top resorts, you can see the impact of over-tourism and a lack of central policy and control and regulation of tourism centres. And when I interviewed in Indonesia, Jokowi, the year before last, one of his top initiatives he was speaking about, so enthusiastic, was he said, we want to build, 100 more Balis, meaning not Bali as it has become, but open up like remote regions of the country. So Indonesia, for example, is putting in money into building airports in remote locations, because if you want to develop remote locations, you've got to get people there. But they've got an eye on the lessons. And if you go to Cambodia and go to Sihanoukville, which I'm sure most people have heard about, there's nearly 80 Chinese casinos in Sihanoukville, and a lot of site of building collapses and things like that. But so I think the impact of over-tourism is a real lesson to be learnt here. But I must say, that said, I was really struck by the photos of, I think it went viral, of the queues waiting to get to the top of Everest. So that sort of seems to me a bit of over-tourism going around up there too.
No, I think that's a big challenge, because I think in our quest of getting into numbers, we have been, sort of really ignored the quality tourism part of it. And Cambodia is a great example of what perhaps not to do in terms of volume tourism, because tourism does bring in, people, connects places, but it does have its challenges, So that's a good point to look at. Yeah.
Can I just say very quickly too, I think most recently we've seen the Philippines take a hard decision to close down Boracay Island for a while, and the Thais are now closing quite a few sort of supposed secluded locations, which are now like sort of completely flooded with tourists. So, they're closing them on a selective basis, and now Indonesia is considering closing Komodo Island. So these are all mainly temporary closures. Some places, I don't know what's happened to Boracay, but I think that's really instructive that they're biting the bullet and maybe killing a bit of a golden goose, but in the end they've got their eye on a broader measure to act against this sort of over-tourism.
Just to reinforce what Gwen, and Nepal can also take good advantage of it, is you should train the young people for higher quality tourism. And if you have better, higher quality tourism, then they can, in fact, instead of being tourism officers or tourist guide, they can be, environmental guides.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, when we are talking about lessons from the East, Bhutan is east of Nepal, and just a day before they announced that now even for the regional tourists, which we have to read as Indian tourists, are now have to pay equivalent to about 1,200 Indian rupees as the development fees that earlier, which they charged to other countries. So that's what Bhutan has done to ensure that the number of tourists are coming, it's the pressure on tourism would be met. And I think again, it's in Africa, but a country I've been working for 8 years now, we've been working in Rwanda, is completely focused about quality tourism. Increase the prices, get the numbers down. And I think, because if you look at Nepal also, one of the things we see is with the services industry, and tourism becomes one part of it. And now, as Val was saying, whether we focus on the high end and sort of low volume, or high value, low value, high volume, that becomes a big challenge. Neeta, I think we can move a bit away from tourism and look at what are some of the things that your friends talk about Southeast Asia, and we were having this very interesting conversation. Maybe you want to share that.
Yeah, no, it was maybe pun earlier, my Southeast Asian colleague saying, really? South Asia colleagues want to learn from us? We tell them that they should learn from you. But no, on that positive note, I also constantly say to our colleagues, even in Filipino colleagues, that some of the good practices, we have such community participation and willingness to pay, conscious habits to pay for it, not just operational costs, capital cost. Actually, Asian Development Bank, we've been supporting these small towns water supply schemes. We're covering 110 towns. I process one of these loans. We take this everywhere in Southeast Asia, South Asia, I'm sending people from Kolkata, from Tamil Nadu, from Andhra Pradesh to come and see and meet our colleagues here, go to villages. The Lagani in roads. So these opportunities to cash on this